Thank you very much and good evening. Assalamu alaikum. Let me start by thanking Salahuddin Imam and Hayat Imam, better known to me as Two Bhai and One Appa, for inviting me to this series. And I'd also like to say a few words of remembrance and tribute to the late Ambassador Hassan Imam, who also was regarded as an uncle to me. I remember very fond memories of Karachi a few decades ago when we were all young, of being with him and spending time with him. So it's a great honor for me to give this lecture in his honor, in his name. What I'm going to do is to do three things. Start with a little bit of science, and then a bit more of the global politics around the issue of climate change. And then I'm going to tell you a story. The story is the story of what the vulnerable countries have done in the climate change arena, the framework convention on climate change. And within that, a very small part that I had the privilege of playing. So I have somewhat of an insider's view of what happened, which I will share with you. So the bit of the science is that climate change is happening. The atmosphere is warming due to the emissions of greenhouse gases that we emit from burning coal, burning oil, burning natural gas, from methane, from a variety of sources. These gases have been put into the atmosphere for the last almost 2 centuries since the Industrial Revolution, and they soak up the sun's energy and heat up the atmosphere. This is science, this is physics, there is no question about this phenomenon. What is new is that if we continue to do this, and the scientific community made this very, very clear through something called the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is a global UN-developed body of scientists who are charged with assessing the level of science, the knowledge base, and of providing guidance to governments on what needs to be done. And the IPCC produced its first report in 1990, which essentially said what I just said, that the emissions of greenhouse gases continue to rise. If they continue to rise, then we are headed on a path over the next century of temperatures rising to the level of 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 degrees, depending on which global circulation model you want to pick. The models all say it's going to go up. They just say by different amounts. So you have a fan of potential temperature rises, anything from 4 to 8 degrees. And in fact, over the last 20 years, we have been moving along the higher end of that fan. So the actuality of temperature rise, we have risen by 1 degree already, temperature, has been on the upper end of that fan. And so the warning from the climate change community was, unless we do something about this, we're headed for potentially catastrophic changes of atmospheric temperatures, which may not seem a lot, but these are significant temperature rises of the order that we have seen in geological time scales when we have ice ages and in between ice ages. These are the kinds of temperature differences of a few degrees centigrade that have caused either an ice age or an interim ice age. So that was the warning from the scientific community. In response to the warning from the scientific community, the global political community, policymaking community responded. And it's an interesting reflection of that time to think of who were some of the key politicians who responded to this. One of them was the then Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Margaret Thatcher, who is a conservative, was a conservative. And conservatives in general are not really great believers in climate change, but she understood it. And one of the reasons why, in my view, was that she had studied chemistry in university. She was a graduate of chemistry. She understood the science. She didn't question the science. She understood and she said, this is important. We need to do something. And the UK were one of the countries that initiated the discussions and negotiations that led to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change being signed in 1992 in Rio. Just as an aside, one of the other leaders at that time who was critical was the then Environment Minister of Germany, who is now the Chancellor of Germany, Angela Merkel, who happened in her previous to political life to be a physics professor in East Germany. And again, understood the science. And as a politician, said we must do something about that. Unfortunately, politicians nowadays tend to not have a science background and hence you get more of the skeptics in politics than you do people who understand science and can relate to it. But that's an aside. So what happened was we have the Framework Convention on Climate Change, agreed in 1992. All countries came together. They agreed to tackle this problem. It's a global problem. Unless we do it together, we're not going to solve it. No country alone can do it. And so the logic behind having a global treaty, we had a negotiation, we had a treaty, we agreed the treaty. Nobody disagreed. The United States was one of the first countries to actually ratify the UN Framework Convention in 1992. Two things about the convention. Firstly, it says that everybody needs to take action. There's a very famous phrase in the UNFCCC called CBDR. It's common but differentiated responsibilities, which means common meaning all countries, all nearly 200 countries that are signed up to the convention need to take action, agree to take action. But, there's a but there, but differentiated in the sense that the rich countries bear a greater responsibility. And they accepted that. They are in the UN Framework Convention, they are listed in an annex. It's called Annex 1. They're listed by name. And they agreed to be listed by name. They accepted that because they were the ones who benefited economically from the Industrial Revolution and the burning of fossil fuels over the last 150 years, they bore a greater degree of responsibility. And they accepted that. They said, we will take more action than the rest of the world, the developing countries. So we bifurcated the world into Annex 1, rich countries, non-Annex 1, everybody else. And in the UN Framework Convention, this is the two groupings of countries, big groupings, that negotiate, not always against each other, but the two big groups. Within these, there are then subgroups, and I'll talk about a few of the subgroups, particularly in the developing country side, the non-Annex 1 side. So the non-Annex 1 countries have a collective negotiating bloc. It's called the Group of 77 and China. It started a long time ago when there were 77 countries. It's now double that almost, with 136 countries. And that is a political group. Each year they elect a chair, and they meet and they have discussions, and they negotiate as a bloc, as a negotiating bloc, by and large. They don't always agree on everything, but they try and negotiate as a group. Within this group of G77 in China, there are subgroups. There are quite a few subgroups, but the significant ones from the point of view of the story I'm going to tell you later are the most vulnerable countries groups. And there are three of them, three distinct groups with overlaps. The first group are the poorest countries in the world. There are about 50 of them, most of them in sub-Saharan Africa, some in Asia, including Bangladesh. These are called the least developed countries, LDCs. It's a historic group that has been identified. It comes actually from the trade, UNCTAD and WTO negotiations. When these poorest countries were given duty-free access to the trade, they formed a group. And they, in the UNFCCC, the same group are also vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, so they have a group that they negotiate as. The other two vulnerable country groups are the small island developing states. These are countries like Fiji, Samoa, and other Pacific islands, Maldives in the Indian Ocean, Haiti, and some of the Caribbean islands in the Caribbean. And there are roughly about 45 or 46 small island developing states. And they negotiate as a bloc. Their negotiating bloc is called the Alliance of Small Island States, AOSIS for short. And then the third group of vulnerable countries are the countries in Africa. This is a geographic and a political group. So every country in Africa belongs to the Africa group, and they negotiate as a group. And that's another 56 countries in Africa. So if you take these three groups into account, there are overlaps. Obviously, a lot of the African countries are LDCs, but they're also in the Africa group. Some small islands are both LDC and Africa. If you take the overlaps into account, there are roughly 100 countries. 100 countries is a significant number because in the international negotiations in the UNFCCC, there's 195 countries. And the G77 in China have 136 countries. So the three vulnerable country groups together, 100 countries, is a majority of the whole UNFCCC. Out of 195, 100 is more than 50%. And they're a supermajority, two-thirds, more than two-thirds, within the G77 in China, 100 countries out of 136. But in the negotiations, their voices are nowhere near reflective of that massive numbers that they have. In the negotiations, they hardly matter. Their voices don't matter. They're not listened to. And so one of the things that over the years I've been doing is I work very closely with the least developed countries group, and then increasingly with the other two groups, is to get the vulnerable countries to get together and voice their concerns together and have strength in unity and use that strength to get their views across and to persuade other groups to agree to what they want. And in the negotiations, as I said, with the negotiators, we've been working very closely. I work as an advisor to the group of least developed countries, of which Bangladesh is one. Bangladesh is a very prominent member. At one point, Bangladesh chaired the group. The current chair is Angola. But the Bangladeshi negotiators are part of the senior negotiating group of the least developed countries. And over years, the least developed countries have become much, much more effective as a group. They're very, at the moment, I'd say a very effective group of negotiators. But negotiations are not everything. Negotiators are mid-level bureaucrats, maybe even senior bureaucrats. They are not political masters. So final decisions at a very high level have to be done by politicians in the end. And the negotiators can only do so much. And so this is where I'm going to start my story. The story begins in 2009, about 6 to 8 months before a major climate summit was going to be held. It was the 15th Conference of Parties in Copenhagen in December of that year. And we were all expecting in Copenhagen to have a new breakthrough treaty that would replace the previous Kyoto Protocol that had been agreed in Kyoto, and have a new dimension or a new direction for tackling climate change with all countries coming together. But we failed. In Copenhagen, we failed to do this. And I'm going to tell you the story of what happened there and then what happened later. So I begin with the story of failure, and I'll end with the story of what I feel is success. So the failure in Copenhagen was the following. And I'll tell you the story now from the perspective that I've been involved in it with the group of countries that I'll describe. So, as I mentioned, at that point in time, before Copenhagen, some months before Copenhagen, at the negotiator level, the three groups of vulnerable countries, we had come together, we had agreed a common position on the long-term temperature. And so, as I said, the temperature matters to us. In the Framework Convention on the temperature, what it says is that we must avoid dangerous climate change. But it doesn't define what is the threshold for dangerous. And the scientific community was asked this question, and they threw it back to the politicians and said, dangerous is in the eye of the beholder. Depends, dangerous for whom? For what? For a particular species of plant or animal, or for fish, or for humans, and which humans? This is something you politicians have to decide. We scientists cannot decide. And so there was a growing consensus around which the UK government under Prime Minister Tony Blair pushed of 2 degrees as being the threshold at which we would not want to go above. We call 2 degrees the threshold for dangerous climate change. However, 2 degrees does not save everybody, particularly the most vulnerable countries, and the most vulnerable people in those countries are still affected by 2 degrees, not good enough. And so amongst the vulnerable country groupings, the 3 groups, we agreed that we would push for 1.5 degrees as the long-term temperature goal, even though other countries were not agreeing to that. And in the negotiations, we pushed for this. But as I said, negotiators are not final decision makers. Negotiators can only do so much on text and details, but when it comes to high-level political decisions, politicians are the decision makers. And even though we had unity amongst the negotiators, we were lacking political leadership on this issue. And at that time, early in that year, there was an election in the Maldives, and the longtime president of the Maldives, President Gayoom, lost the election to a radical young journalist come politician called Nasheed. He became the president of Maldives. And very soon after he became president, he traveled to London and he gave a public lecture, much like this, in the Commonwealth Institute in London, which I attended. And after his lecture, and it was actually almost similar to this kind of a room, maybe a bit bigger, I walked up to him and introduced myself. And I told him that in the climate change negotiations, at the level of the negotiators, we had achieved great unity on the long-term temperature goal of 1.5 degrees, but we needed political leadership. And Maldives was particularly suitable as a country because they belong both to the LDC group and to the AOSIS group, the small island states. So they, by themselves, cover two groups. And they need to reach out to the Africa group to get all three groups. I spoke to him for about 5 minutes, and then he called over his High Commissioner, another political, she was a lady who was a political appointee who was in the opposition with him when he was in opposition, introduced me to her and told her to follow up with me and get a briefing from me on what I was telling him. And sure enough, within a week, she called me, invited me over, and we had a very long conversation. And I explained to her the situation and what I was proposing. She asked me to write it up, which I did, and give it to her. And she sent it on to President Nasheed. And then within months, he convened a meeting of the leaders of these three groups in the Maldives, in Malé. And he very graciously invited me to go and speak to them, to give the keynote speech to these leaders. He got about 15 countries to be represented. There was one other head of state. He was the president of Kiribati, President Tong. Others were all ministers. The Prime Minister of Bangladesh was invited, but she happened to be visiting Bhutan on a state visit at that time, so she couldn't go herself. She sent two ministers. She sent the Foreign Minister, Dipu Mani, and she sent the Environment Minister, Hassan Mahmood. And we spent 3 days in Maldives in a very nice island resort, all together, having breakfast, lunch, dinner together. It was a very cordial atmosphere, discussing what to do, and they came up with two things. Firstly, they formed a group. They called themselves the Climate Vulnerable Forum. This was not a new negotiating bloc because they all belong to the existing three negotiating blocs, but at a leadership level, heads of state, politicians formed this group called the Climate Vulnerable Forum, and they agreed that they would push this idea of the 1.5 degree temperature goal going forward. So then we came to Copenhagen. In Copenhagen, there were all kinds of things. It was extremely cold, freezing, snowing. There were thousands of people in the meeting, overflowing, not being able to come in, so they cut the numbers of people allowed in. It was total chaos. And at the end, heads of state started flying in, unscheduled. Once they knew Obama was going to be there, everybody came in, including our Prime Minister. 100 heads of state with their entourages, walking around the hall. Not much to do. They give speech for 5 minutes. What else are they going to do? They're hanging around there. And then, and finally, and that's one of the diagnoses afterwards of Copenhagen of one of the reasons why it failed, is that the heads of state came at the end before the negotiations have ended. And so they had to do the negotiations themselves. President Obama was sitting with the Chinese president and writing down words and saying, is this okay with you? Presidents should not be negotiating. They should be signing agreements that have been negotiated by others. And that's one of the reasons why it failed. But in that small huddle of heads of state that were left there, let me tell you the anecdote. So this is the last evening of the COP. Heads of state are all in town. We get news that there's a blizzard approaching Washington, which incidentally is happening right now as well. And Obama has to leave to get into DC before the blizzard arrives, or else he won't be able to land. His plane won't be able to land. So he has to leave. And the heads of state are in some room upstairs. We don't know where they are, but there are thousands of us in the big hall watching television monitors. They're meeting, they're talking. And then next thing we know on the monitor, this is around 9 o'clock p.m., we see Obama leaving, getting into a helicopter, goes to the airport, gets onto Air Force One. Air Force One takes off. And then live from Air Force One, he's talking to the American journalists on Air Force One. So he's talking to them. He says, we have an agreement. I just signed it. We've agreed. The Chinese president, the Indian Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, we've all agreed. It's a very good agreement, et cetera, et cetera. And we are standing in the hall. Where is this agreement? What is this agreement? And then around midnight, the Danish Prime Minister convened the COP, the negotiators, and the agreement was passed around. And he expected to just gavel it through. This was done. The heads of state have agreed it. Who's going to open this up? It's all done. It's just a formality. And then the Venezuelan ambassador, a woman very, very effective, very courageous, very outspoken woman. She took her name piece of wooden name thing of the country name, picked it up and started banging it so hard she cut her hand, and she didn't allow him to continue until she was given the floor. And she said, my president at that time was Hugo Chavez. He was in Copenhagen, but he wasn't in the small room with the other heads of state. He was not consulted. He has given me instructions. We do not agree to anything that he has not been consulted on. So we do not agree to this. And then country after country took the floor. We do not agree. We do not agree. And the poor Danish prime minister was at a complete loss. He didn't know what was going on, didn't know what to do. And we heard later the story that on the UK side, at that time the prime minister of the UK was Gordon Brown, and his environment minister was a gentleman called Ed Miliband, who later became leader of the Labour Party and now is no longer leader of the Labour Party. But he was the environment minister at that time. And he'd gone to bed. He'd felt, Gordon Brown was in the room when the disagreements were made. And they felt it's done, so they went to bed. So the lead delegate from the UK called up his minister and said, come, things are falling apart, you have to come back. So he came back, took the floor, and he asked for a break. He asked the Prime Minister, the chair of the COP, please let's take a break. We're not getting anywhere now. We need to discuss this, so let's take an hour break, which became a 6-hour, 7-hour break after that. So they broke. And in the break, one group went to the Danish Prime Minister and said, sir, you're very tired, you should take some rest, to go to bed, hand over to your deputy to take over. Ban Ki-moon was there. They were all, twisting arms, talking to the other people. President Nasheed was there. And in the end, what happened was, and this is unprecedented, the Copenhagen Agreement that had been agreed by heads of state of all the major countries, but not all countries, just major countries, was rejected. It was not adopted, it was taken note of. The COP took note of the agreement. They said, fine, you guys made an agreement. If somebody wants to sign up to it, they can sign up to it. But we, the UNFCCC, 195 countries, do not adopt it. So Copenhagen ended in a failure. There was no agreement in Copenhagen. We later on picked up the pieces, and the year later in Cancun, did some of the other things. So I won't go into the details of that. But of Copenhagen itself, we had failed. Everybody agreed it was a failure, but everybody has a different explanation or a different villain as to who was responsible for the failure. Americans point at the Chinese point at the Americans, and everybody points at everybody else. But the interesting bit of the story from my story is the following. In that small group of countries, President Nasheed, heads of state, President Nasheed managed to stay in there. And he kept on fighting for the long-term goal to be 1.5 degrees. President and President Obama agreed to not have 1.5 degrees. Okay? Neither of them wanted 1.5. They stuck to 2. And so poor Nasheed got overruled. He just could not fight them. But what he did, and he did this very cleverly, he inserted into the Copenhagen Agreement, the last paragraph of the Copenhagen Agreement, that we will review the long-term temperature goal between 2013 and 2015. So even though we adopt 2 degrees now, this is open to a review, and we will review it later. This is 2009. A few years from now, 5 years from now, 2015, we'll review this. He planted a little bomb, a little hand grenade, silent hand grenade. Nobody noticed it. Okay. Now, during that period, in the UNFCCC process, there has been a review. It's called the Structured Expert Dialogue between 2013 and 2015. The UNFCCC invited scientists from the IPCC to examine this question of the long-term goal, and in particular, look at what is the difference between a temperature rise of 2 degrees and a temperature rise of 1.5 degrees. And in June of 2015, they produced a report. It's on the UNFCCC website, and I'll summarize it for you. The summary of their report was the following. They said with 2 degree temperature rise, if we can keep the temperature rise below 2 degrees, we will effectively be able to protect most countries, most people, most ecosystems, but not all. If we want to protect all, then the temperature goal needs to be 1.5 degrees. Between that 1.5 and 2, the half degrees is critical not for the rich, but for the poorest people, the most vulnerable people. Okay? They are the ones who will suffer. And this report was actually not adopted in the UNFCCC at the pre-Paris meeting when it was presented. And it then went to Paris. And this was, the adoption of this report was the technical way of revisiting the temperature goal of 2 degrees. Do we accept the report or don't accept the report? And until the very last minute, countries tried to stop acceptance, and the one left standing at the very end, and I'll come to that in a minute, but I'll tell you who it is Saudi Arabia. They stopped, they would not allow the adoption of the report. But anyway, so technically, the negotiating issue was adoption of the structured expert dialogue on the long-term temperature goal. Should we accept? Not accept. If we accept it, then 1.5 degrees needs to be adopted as the temperature goal. So let me shift to the Climate Vulnerable Forum and say what happened after the Maldives meeting. After the meeting in Maldives, President Tong of Kiribati took over the meeting. So the forum continued. President Tong of Kiribati became the president of it. He held a meeting in Kiribati. After him, it came to Bangladesh. Prime Minister Hasina was the third leader of the group. She had a big meeting in Dhaka and Sonargaon in 2013. By that time, the forum members had increased to about 20 or 30 countries were joining. After Bangladesh, it went to President Castro of Costa Rica, and after Costa Rica, it went to the Philippines. So 2015, going into Paris, it was under the chairmanship or the presidency of President Aquino of the Philippines. And what the Philippines did was, a few weeks before the Paris meeting, they invited high-level officials from the Climate Vulnerable Forum to the Philippines for a 3-day planning session. And the way the Climate Vulnerable Forum itself functions, it functions on a troika system, which means that the current president, the sitting president, along with the 2 previous presidents, the one immediately before him or her, and the one before that. The 3 countries together are the governing body. The 3 talk to each other, organize, say what they want to do, and then invite others and bring them on board. So Philippines, Costa Rica, and Bangladesh are the troika at the moment, up till now. Next year, it goes to Ethiopia. We now know who it's going to go to. Philippines will hand over to Ethiopia. After that, Bangladesh is no longer part of the troika. Then it becomes Ethiopia, Philippines, and Costa Rica part of the troika. So in this troika-led meeting in Philippines, Bangladesh was represented at a fairly high level by doubly, because I said originally there were 2 ministries involved, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Ministry of Environment. So they've always been together on this. And in fact, it's been led by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. When the meeting was held in Dhaka, it was the Ministry of Foreign Affairs that led on it. Ambassador Saifur was very much involved. And in the Manila meeting, Bangladesh was represented by high officials from both the Foreign Ministry and the Environment Ministry. And what happened in Manila were 2 things. The Paris relevant one was we reiterated our strategy for asking for the 1.5 degree goal, and that we would now raise the ante in terms of wanting this and asking for it, and in fact telling the French and everybody else that this was our sine qua non for a Paris agreement. If we don't get it, then we don't agree to anything in Paris. We need to have this. And so we mobilized these 100 countries. Going forward, there was a lot of interest from civil society, in particular one of the big international NGOs, CARE International, mobilized civil society. They had a website for us in which countries that were joining the 1.5 degree countries would be added up, and you go 100 countries, and then 101, and then 102, and then 103, and so. And there was a big public campaign with a hand signal, which I'll show you. So the hand signal was this: 1 with a circle and 5, 1.5. So everybody around the world, if you go on the website, you'll find hundreds of photographs of people standing like this. 1.5 to survive. Right? This was the slogan and the photograph and the hand signal. And thousands of people. And there's a hand signal. On the last day of the Manila meeting, we were all taken to the Malacanang Palace of the President, where the meeting was finalized. And before going, we were all given a very nice Filipino shirt, what is it called, the barong, to wear. So we're all wearing barongs, and we're all standing in a big photograph with all of us with the hand signal. So we launched this campaign, big campaign in Manila, and took it to Paris. In Paris, on the first day, so one of the things that the French learned from the mistakes of the Danes was don't bring the heads of state in the end. They only cause chaos. Bring them in the beginning, let them make a big speech, and tell them to go home, and let negotiators negotiate. So in Paris, the heads of state were invited on day one, the 30th of November, and then they were asked to go. And then we continued for 2 weeks for negotiating the deal, and we got it on the 12th of December. And so on the 30th of November, we had Barack Obama, we had heads of state, we had 100 plus heads of state. Our head of state government, Sheikh Hasina, didn't go. We were accompanied by our Minister for Environment. And on the 30th of November, there were many different speeches, meetings. The Climate Vulnerable Forum held a big meeting where a number of new members joined. So the numbers went up to about 70 or 80. Ethiopia became endorsed as the new chair. And under the presidency, under President Aquino, who chaired that meeting, and I was given the privilege of moderating that discussion, we had the minister from Costa Rica and the minister from Bangladesh speak, and the president of Philippines speak, and he declared the 1.5 degree temperature goal. So we're starting, today is the 30th of November, we have 2 more weeks of negotiation. We want 1.5 degrees. This is our one big demand, and we want other countries to support our demand. And then immediately after the meeting, there was a big civil society gathering, generated support from civil society, from the media, on the 1.5 degree campaign. And over the next 2 weeks, as I said, country after country came around to agreeing to us. And I'll share my view of how and why that happened. So the big pushback that we had on the 1.5 degrees was from both the large developed countries, US, Europe, as well as the upcoming developing countries, China, India, etc., was that it's impractical. It's just too difficult to do. Okay, so guys, stop asking for this because it's too difficult for us to deliver it. But our argument was it may be difficult, but it's not impossible. And as long as it's not impossible, it's the right thing to do. And in Paris, the leaders of the world need to give a signal that is, including everybody on the planet, is going to be protected. And if they agree to a 2 degree temperature goal, they are explicitly saying to the poorest people, we cannot protect you. We will protect ourselves, but sorry guys, you are on your own. We are not going to protect you because it's too difficult for us to reduce our emissions, to do all that's necessary. And that was a very bad message, particularly for the democracies, to say out loud. So they said it behind closed doors to us. It's very difficult, please don't push this. But when they're outside in front of the camera and their own newsmen were asking them, why don't you agree with the vulnerable country demand 1.5 degrees? They can't say, it's too difficult, we don't want to do it. Okay? They just don't want to do it. Okay? They told us they can't do it. What they were saying was, we won't do it. We can, but we won't. Okay? And they were not able to say that in public to the cameras. And so one after one, including the United States, they started saying, okay, 1.5 degrees, 1.5 degrees. And at one point, the Indian minister, in fact, made a joke about this. He said, why 1.5? Why not 1 degree? Facetious joke that he made. And we went to the Indian NGOs and we told them, go tell your minister, he's insulting us. Okay? You shouldn't do that. He's pissing off 100 countries who are asking for 1.5 degrees. This is not a trivial matter. And he apologized. He said, I didn't mean to. So we pushed them. We made them. One by one, they had to come and agree with a 1.5 degree temperature rise. Now, 1.5 degrees is not the target. The target remains 2 degrees, but we are now aspiring to get to 1.5 degrees. It's an aspirational target. It's a very difficult target to achieve. There are a lot of questions as to its practicality, but it's nevertheless, it's embedded in the Paris Agreement, something that when we went to Paris, only the vulnerable countries wanted. The big developed countries did not want it. The big developing countries did not want it. Over 2 weeks, we managed to persuade them to change their minds and agree to our demand. So in diplomatic terms, I think there was a major victory for the vulnerable countries for effective diplomacy, effective campaigning, effective use of civil society and media to get an outcome that we think is the right outcome. So that's the story of the 1.5 degree temperature goal.
Which year was Paris?
It was a few weeks ago, the 12th of December. And let me end the story with a little bit more on the Climate Vulnerable Forum and its evolution. One of the interesting evolutions of the forum itself over time has been that it is no longer just a one-trick pony. It's not just about 1.5 degrees temperature rise. That's an important part of it. It's a high-level part, if you like. But below that, there's been a lot of discussion about countries working together, cooperating, South-South cooperation. And under the Philippines presidency, the president of Philippines, Benigno Aquino, and his finance minister took a very interesting initiative of the finance ministers of the Climate Vulnerable Forum forming their own group. They call themselves V20, but effectively they're the finance ministers of the vulnerable countries. And they met for the first time last year in 2015 in Lima, Peru, at the time of the IMF World Bank meeting. So at the IMF World Bank annual meeting, all finance ministers from all over the world get together, usually in Washington, but sometimes in other places. Yes, last year it happened to be in Lima, Peru. And on the side of the World Bank IMF meeting, I think a half-day meeting, the vulnerable country finance ministers came together and formed the V20. And finance ministers are not negotiators. They're not talking about Paris. They're masters of their budgets and resource mobilization. And they decided that we, the vulnerable countries, are going to do stuff. We're going to help each other. We're going to work together. We're going to do South-South cooperation. So in Manila, when we were there, we developed a 3-year roadmap of what the vulnerable countries are going to do together about helping each other. And on that note, it was started by Costa Rica. Costa Rica has started and set up a South-South Center on renewable energy. Costa Rica is the fastest growing renewable energy program in the world. They're planning to go completely 100% renewable energy by about 2021. And then when we were in the Philippines announced a South-South Center on climate information. They have a very, very good Met department that has a lot of capacity, do a lot of warnings because they're typhoon dependent, vulnerable country. So they declared their Met department into a South-South Center on climate information. And at the moment, I'm trying to get the Bangladesh government, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Ministry of Environment to propose that Bangladesh also have a South-South Center on adaptation technology, because there's a lot of adaptation experience in Bangladesh, which we can share with other countries. So I haven't convinced the government yet, but I'm hoping that they'll agree to do this. So what is happening with the Climate Vulnerable Forum in practice, in between the COPs, is we are now looking to tackle climate change in reality, on the ground, share our experience with each other, and help each other, so that the Climate Vulnerable Forum, the vulnerable countries, become actually leaders in tackling climate change. By example, doing things, not waiting for the rest of the world to come to the rescue, but doing things, tackling climate change, and sharing that with everybody else. So that's the end of my story. Let me stop there, and I'm very happy to take any questions. Thank you.